Okay, we're joined here with our chief engineer at Genome Technologies, Lyndon Noble. Thanks for joining us, Lyndon. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to avoid some of the pitfalls that come up when you're dealing with large-scale THC crystallization. So, Lyndon, when you're scaling up THCa crystallization, what do you think is the most prevalent issue for our viewers to watch out for?
Yeah, the most challenging situation that we encounter is really when you have low THCa in your crude or a high amount of THCa that's already been decarboxylated.
So it's like low quality crude essentially.
Yeah. The lower the quality of the crude, the lower the cost of your biomass inputs, in general, can yield a harder crystallization.
So example, this might be like old biomass that's been sitting around. A lot of that THC is now decarboxylated just from sitting there, and then that ends up in your crude. So it's resisting crystallization.
Yeah, exactly. The THC will inhibit that crystallization process. And also there's just less THCa in the solution to begin with. And so it's harder to get to that super saturation point where crystals will form.
Okay. And so what are some kind of ways that you can deal with that?
So there's kind of three main things that we'll do to address that situation. First, what we'll try and do is manipulate the temperature because that's easiest. We'll go a little bit colder and see if we can get it to crash.
Okay.
Then we'll inject propane. Sometimes that will help us because THCa is less soluble in propane than is butane. You can get the crash to happen that way. Or the third, and one of the most effective ways that we have to deal with really low THCa crude is to actually add more THCa to the solution from a previous crystallization.
Interesting.
And that can help that crystallize.
You're almost like seeding it.
Yeah, exactly. We're increasing the ratio of THCa to T.
Okay, so it's not seeding it, but it brings up the THCa level to the point where it's going to reach supersaturation.
That's exactly it. Yeah, seeding is more when you're growing crystals or forming nucleation points. This is just manipulating the ratios. Yeah.
What's another way that people get hung up when they're trying to do crystallizations?
Yeah, another really common one is that they'll have too much solvent in their solution when they're trying to perform their crystallization. It'll be too dilute. And what'll happen is when you really dilute, you'll slowly start to grow crystals as opposed to, crashing them by being super saturated. And so you'll kind of be spinning and you'll see a little bit of crystallization happening, but it's a challenging one to diagnose until you've seen it a few times because it looks like your crystallization is happening, but ultimately it's not going to propagate fully. And so what we'll do to mitigate that is we will heat the solution back up, we'll remove a little bit more solvent, and then we'll do the crystallization again.
Okay, so the ability to redissolve that solution and start over is kind of critical in that then.
Yeah, exactly. If you try and take that solution all the way to the point where you're filtering it, it's a huge waste of time essentially. So having the ability to instantly switch it back to heating mode, pull off a little bit of solvent to resaturate, and then switch it back to cooling mode to do your crystallization again allows you the maneuverability to adjust your solvent ratio really, or your dilution amount.
Okay, and if you can't do that and you have to push it downstream, you said it's a waste of time. What exactly makes that a waste of time?
Well, what'll happen is if you are way too dilute, you'll start forming some THCa crystals, but a lot of the THCa will stay in solution. And then so when you go to wash the crystals that you do have, unfortunately, you'll wash that HTE away, which will wash away a lot of your desirable compounds.
So a lot of the THCa will end up in the HTE fraction.
Yeah, and you might not realize it until you've sent your HTE out for testing. But and really the effective, the way that we mitigate against that is by recognizing the visual cue that your crystallization is propagating too slowly and it's not happening correctly, and then you can adjust for it.
Got it. Okay, so that's if you're too dilute on the solution going into your crystallization. What about the opposite?
So too concentrated is an issue that we don't have to spend a lot of time explaining in general because you end up with a thick toffee or a rock at the bottom of your crystallizer and you can't get it to mix. Really understanding why that's an issue though is really that the THCa molecules can't find each other, and so they can't form crystals and they can't properly crystallize out.
It's basically crude. Yeah, it just becomes the normal crude oil that people drain out of their hydrocarbon extractor that obviously is not in crystal form.
Yeah. And there's one sort of saving grace when you're in that situation is that often when if you're pretty thick, but you can still mix it a little bit, oftentimes you will be able to supersaturate it, and we found that we can inject cold solvent at that time and we can get the crystallization reaction to happen. So you can kind of, save the process without having to do very much extra work. That being said, though, if you are too concentrated and you've ejected solvent, you can't get that crystallization reaction to go. Right. The solution is the same. You heat up the jacket of your crystallizer, you redissolve the crude, and remove the solvent again to get it to a little bit more dilute, a little bit lower viscosity of the solution, right, and do the crystallization again.
So you've got the ability to start over.
Yeah,
and it's not too painful. No. The challenge is if you're doing it in like a column or something like that, you really can only go one way.
Yeah, you can only cool, and so you don't have the capacity to restart the process or adjust your solvent ratios or redissolve anything.
Right, having that mixture and having the ability to both heat and cool the vessel was the key differentiator there.
Yeah, you can imagine if you filled something that is only cold, that can only be cooled with a thick resinous solution, and you realize it's too thick, you could be days, you're going to be scraping that out and trying to redissolve it by performing some other step. It's very challenging to recover from that. And really the crystallizer, a lot of the times when you're processing a new crude, there's a lot to be learned. You'll watch. One of the things we'll do often is we'll boil all of the solvent off of a big batch to know exactly how much crude is in the vessel state, and then we'll redilute it so that we have a more certainty around our ratios.
It sounds like you're getting to know the properties of the concentrate that you're working with, and it could be different from different growers. It could be different, maybe different lots.
It's different every time, really. And if for instance, a high amount of terpenes in a crude will actually significantly impact the viscosity. So you'll be a lot less viscous while you're at those colder temperatures if you have a really terpy extract.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So Linné, what if you have a concentrate that's really high in fats and waxes? Does that inhibit the crystallization process?
To a degree. So fats and waxes are pretty interesting in the sense that you'll still be able to crystallize a lot of the time, but there's a certain subset of fats and waxes that will precipitate out at the same time as THCa.
It's just like a de-wax. Sometimes you see like column de-wax or something in old school hydrocarbon systems.
Yeah. So the challenge with that is if you're precipitating THCa and the waxes are falling out at the same time, you end up with a waxy THCa isolate at the end of it, and that's obviously not desirable. So what we found the most effective way to do that is, the crystallization process is really similar to the de-wax process with one main difference, is that you can coagulate waxes when your solution is very dilute.
Oh, interesting.
So what we'll do is we'll fill the solution, we'll fill the collection pot up, or the crystallizer up with a bunch of solvent, we'll cool it down, and then the waxes will coagulate out, right? And we'll filter those with one of our filters.
And then so there's a downstream filtration step that allowed you to kind of keep your collection vessel clear of those waxes.
Exactly. Yeah, we have a downstream filter where we will drain the crystallizer now with the coagulated waxes in it, deposit those waxes onto a filter, and then send it back to the crystallizer now devoid of those waxes. Well, so you can perform the crystallization step.
What happens if you're dropping the temperature of the solution and you drop that temperature too quickly?
Yeah, what we found is that there's a strong correlation between how fast you cool and how fine the THCa crystals are. What we typically suggest operators do is they do kind of a ramping and a step function when they're cooling your crystallizer down. So we'll cool it down in steps, just deliberately slow that crystallization down and try and get 100 micron crystals, crystals that are large enough that you can filter and wash them really easily.
So like salt, table salt type of size?
Yeah, exactly. If you go right down to as cold as possible, your crystals will form into a much siltier, muddy like consistency. That's hard to clean off, as you can imagine. Hard to wash mud and get sand.
Well, the solution doesn't drain.
Yeah, exactly.
When you're performing a THCa crystallization, what are some of the things that could limit how much THCa actually ends up crystallized as opposed to in the solution?
Yeah, there's a bunch of factors. I think mostly what we're doing is we're trying to control the crystallization so that it's predictable and easy to wash. But also there's some equipment limitations to consider as well too. We're using the fact that THCa doesn't dissolve. Once it's already crystallized, it doesn't really readily dissolve into butane again. And so you can wash off the HCE. But what'll happen is if you have kind of these areas where the THCa has the opportunity to warm up, or if you're sending in solvent that's too warm, you will redissolve the THCa that you're trying to wash off. And so it's very important to have a jacket that completely covers the filtration area or any part of the vessel where you might be trying to wash those THCa crystals off.
Where the crystallization component.
Yeah. The crystallization component, the filtration component, everything has to be kept very cold, and you can't have any hot spots essentially, because you'll start to form, shatter inside of your vessel, or you'll redissolve some of the THCa. So yeah, just temperature control is very important.
After you perform the crystallization and you've drained the HD out of the crystallization vessel and done some solvent washing to wash away and purify, why is it important to be able to redissolve that THC isolate?
If you're going to be doing a second crystallization, you'll want to redissolve your THCa entirely before you start your second crystallization, so that you can get a uniform crystal size for washing. But also, if you're going to be ejecting the crystals or the THCa from the system, either into a diamond binder or just directly into isolate, it's most effective to redissolve into a solvent and transfer it as a fluid, or eject it from the system as a thick slurry that will then, foam up like spray foam almost, or Cheetos. We call it Cheeto tech often. For your you've redissolved your THCa in butane, and then heated it to the point where when you eject it from the system, there's enough residual heat in the solution that you're extruding the foam out of.
Oh, okay. So there's both the pressure that you're creating, and then also you're heating it to concentrate it down to that consistency.
Yeah, because we don't want to be losing a lot of solvent while we're doing that process, but also opening up a crystallizer and trying to scoop THCa from the inside is challenging, and you can often incur losses, or you can have contaminants coming in, so it's much easier to have it exit the system as a liquid.
Safer too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And people have just old boof biomass sitting around that they just, they don't really have a market for. The question I get a lot is how much ratio of like THC to THCa, so how much of that THCa that's been decarboxylated, is it still viable to make it into like a crystallized product?
Yeah, good question. THC seems to be one of the most, impeding factors to getting a good crystallization. A good way of looking at it, I typically describe it as, is we'll often add a little bit of THC back to shatter to prevent it from crystallizing. And we find that somewhere around 10%, you start to, inhibit that crystallization really effectively. But one of the good things about running the crystallizer is that you can add more THCa back into the process to shift that ratio if you're not doing your good crystallization.
Oh, okay. And how would you do that?
So essentially what we'd do is we would remove the solvent and depressurize the system, and then we would typically vacuum load the powder. So we'd pull a vacuum on the crystallizer, we would pull the THCa in on top of our crude, and then we would redissolve it and make it into a cohesive mixture.
Okay, so you've got this like vessel full of crude, it's not really gonna be able to crystallize. And then you take powder, you add the powder back to it, and then it allows you to crystallize the rest of the isolate that's in the crude.
Yeah, exactly. You're reducing the impact that the THC has on the THCa by increasing the amount of THCa there is relative to the effect.
You're diluting the THC, and increasing the proportion of THCa to THC. Really cool.
Yeah, one of the other things that we're doing in order to crystallize crude that has lower THCa or higher THC is often a slower crystallization will also help us. So we'll leave it overnight. We'll get a client to leave their crystallizer cold overnight, and sometimes it'll crash out that way. The other thing that you can try is to, lower the temperatures on your crystallization, add a little bit more propane. These will kind of help you get a crystallization if you're kind of on the edge of where it's going to be possible. But I think that, in the long run, using THCa to your advantage is going to be the most productive and most predictable course of action.
One of the things that's really important to extractors is after they've done their crystallization and they separated the high terpene extract, the amount of THC that's left in that high terpene extract kind of determines like how efficient that process is, right? Like if you've got half of your THC still in the high terpene extract, then your crystallization really wasn't that effective and the process really isn't viable. What's as low as you can really get it? What do you think? And how do you optimize that?
I think that one of the main issues is that when you are performing a crystallization and your crystals form too finely, they can easily be washed away and more readily redissolved in your washing solution when you're washing it with clean butane. One of the main ways we mitigate against this is we actually slow down the crystallization deliberately so that it happens almost instantly, but over the course of about 20 minutes. And what we found is that allows us to form crystals that are about 100 microns in size. They're a little bit bigger, and so you're less likely to wash them away when you perform your washing step.
And when you say wash it away, it's like it gets redissolved when you're passing cold solvent over the isolate to push the HTE into the next vessel.
That's right. Or if you're using a 10 micron filter, for example, and your crystal size is 5 microns, then you're likely to wash them through the filter as well. Right. So by saying clog the filter, yeah. So really a big part of what we're doing when we're controlling the temperature and the timing around the crystallization is we're actually keeping it on the edge of where it's crystallizing, but slowing it down deliberately so that we can grow that crystal size a little bit larger so that the filtration steps are easier.
The way the crystallization process works is you're getting to supersaturation, means there's too much THC in a solution. In this case, the terpenes are the solution. Once you get below that threshold, you can't necessarily crystallize any further. There's kind of a limit there.
We've got a number of strategies that we use to be able to crystallize low THCa crude. One of the things that we're working on is to remove the terpene fraction without decarboxylation, and we think that could positively impact getting the last little bit.
So like distillation, you're going to get THC at the end of it. It may not be, it may decarboxylate in the process, but you're going to be able to recover some THC at the expense of the high terpene fraction.
Yeah, that's definitely an approach, but also stripping the terpenes out of a HTE without decarboxylating will diminish the solvent effect that the terpenes have on our solution.
So you can increases the concentration of THCa relative to terpenes. That's right. Yeah, and then causing it to precipitate. Yeah, absolutely. You guys have experimented with a few methods for reprocessing the HTE to get more THC or THC isolate out of the extract, right?
And with reprocessing HTE, what we'll do is we'll add THCa back in to help to get it to crystallize. We'll do the crystallization with more propane. We'll do the crystallization colder, more dilute, or over more time. And there's a number of strategies that we can use to get more THCa out of the HTE, or ideally completely strip the HTE of THCa.
How do you get the highest purity output for when you're making THC isolate or diamonds?
Yeah, so what we found to be the most effective strategy for increasing the purity is actually to do recrystallizations. Typically, when we do our first crystallization, we're aiming to crash out. We're removing the bulk of the solution, but we're aiming for about 95 to 98% purity on the first crash.
Right.
And really, the ultimate goal is to make the next crystallizations a lot easier and a lot higher purity. And that's why it's very important to be able to redo your crashes, switch between heating and cooling, and recrash multiple times over the course of a day. Because then instead of focusing on trying to wash your crystals really effectively the first time, you can actually just redissolve and re-perform that crystallization. And crystallization is a fantastic purification step. It works really well to produce high purity. So if you're starting with 97, you're going to be above 99 on your second crystallization. You're very low in treatment.
Right. So the process would be isolate, wash, redissolve, isolate, wash, redissolve, and then potentially go into a diamond miner, or potentially just come out as like a spray foam type product.
Yeah, exactly. So if we were trying to perform isolate, we would crystallize and then heat it back up, redissolve, and then crystallize again. If we're going to be going to a diamond format, we would do that first crash to get to a relatively high purity. And then we would transfer it to a diamond miner to do a slower crystallization.
Right.
And you have this added benefit of the secondary crystallization in the miner being a whole lot faster than if you were to grow diamonds in the traditional sense with the HTE present. And the reason for that is because you've got mostly just butane and THCa in solution, and so that diamond growth is going to be a lot faster.
And so it sounds like really just the initial crystallization, the initial redissolve is enough, because you're doing that secondary crystallization when you're growing the diamonds. So you actually do a double crystallization, increasing the purity of the diamonds either way, as a secondary advantage to like how fast that process actually goes. Most of our customers that are using diamond miners or jars, like you said, HTE present, it's like a 3-week process, 2 to 3 weeks. How long does that process take if you're doing a crystallization and then pouring it off and you're going through diamond miners?
Yeah, it's remarkably faster. So we can pull out 0.1 gram to 0.2 gram diamonds out after it sits overnight. So over a 12 to 24 hour period, we can crystallize a lot of the THCa in solution. Often we'll send that mother liquor to a secondary crystallization step, but the diamonds grow a lot faster because, again, the presence of terpenes in traditional diamond mining, they act as a solvent and they hold that THCa back and they slow that crystallization down. So you have a lot more control when you're only dealing with 2 chemicals.
And the concentration of that THCa is very high. And so you mentioned 0.2 gram, but like what if you want to grow bigger diamonds? Is it 0.2 gram overnight? How about like larger? What would be the process?
Yeah, so essentially, in order the amount of time that it takes is directly proportional to how large the diamonds will grow. So essentially, what you do is you would add a little bit more salt. You would be a bit more dilute in your diamond miner, and you would off gas it slower or heat it less so that the diamonds form slower and form larger diamonds.
It's slow in this process is like how many hours?
Over the course of a week, you would grow much larger diamonds than if you off-gas it faster and tried to do it overnight.
But we're saying like 36 hours is like 1 grammers kind of, and then overnight is like, quarter grammers type of thing.
Exactly, yeah. And so what a lot of our clients are finding is that, the 0.1 gram to a quarter gram are perfect for, it's very easy to package. It's a very manageable product. But if you are looking to grow, multi-gram faceted diamonds, you can do that with this.
It's more for the ground.
Yeah. For bragging rights.
Yeah.
You could do it, and you're well equipped to do it if you have just THCa and butane in your solution. That primary crystallization goes a really long way to improving the process.
Right, but those bragging diamonds might be like a month process or something if it's traditional type jar tech or...
Yeah, and sometimes if you want to grow really, really large crystals, you can redissolve in another solvent that is even slower to leave the butane.
Right, the Pentane recrystallization.
Yeah, Pentane, Heptane. You probably want to avoid hexane because it's... Yeah, you can really slow the solvent leaving the solution, and so you can really increase the size of the crystals that way.
Yeah, I've heard Pentane is kind of the optimal secondary solvent for growing large diamonds.
We've heard that as the most common one. It's convenient and it's relatively easy to get rid of. It boils at around 30 degrees Celsius, so it's pretty convenient to use.
And that's covered by Murphy in our controlled crystallization course.
Yeah, we do that course, absolutely.
Cool, awesome. When working with fresh frozen material, doing live resin extractions, a lot of people are doing this process. They call it liquid live resin, and they're putting that into the vape carts. It goes through a decarboxylation process. How would you handle, optimal decarb for, a live resin product?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 main ways that I would approach it. One is I would separate the terpene fraction to HTE from the isolate, and then I would decarb the isolate separately and then recombine it. That has benefits because you're never subjecting the HTE to heat. You never risk degrading it, having any thermal degradation or losing any terpenes. The other way that people do it is they will perform the decarboxylation under pressure, and so they'll keep the terpenes intact that way, where they just heat up the entire vessel to decarboxylation temperatures and then cool it down.
What are the advantages or disadvantages of either of those?
There's less steps. So if you're going to be transferring the the entire live resin solution to a pressure vessel and then heating it up, there's a lot less, there's less steps. You're not performing crystallization in advance, and it has advantages there, but you are going to be heating the solution that has the terpenes in it. And so you could see thermal degradation. You could impact the flavor profile. And although it shouldn't be, intact and you shouldn't lose anything, it does seem like sometimes things will skew when they're heated and colors will change. And if there is any oxygen present, you can get a little bit of oxidation. And so a more ingredient-based approach, in my opinion, is to separate the HTE from the THCA, decarboxylate the THCA into THC, recombine those two. The other benefit to that, which is pretty significant actually, is that you can take THCA from a lower quality material and use it with a higher quality HCE. Often the value is tied of a product is tied to how nice the terpene profile is. But THCA is THCA, it's just a molecule. And so if you have the capacity to combine the amount of HTE that you would like, that is most effective from a commercial perspective, then you have a lot more control. You can get a lot more value out of a specific flavor profile.
Right. And so let's say the HTE fraction is actually enough to make 10,000 vapes, whereas if you could just decarboxylated it, you actually maybe lose a little bit of terpenes in that process, and also maybe it's only enough for 5,000 vapes because you're not really in full control of the ingredients that or the formulation that you're using for that.
Yeah, so to further that too, you can have vapes that are too high they're running too much terpenes. So we would find often when we were doing fresh live resin runs, sometimes that it was almost too saucy and we needed to add more THC. But we often found that the most value that we could stretch over the crop was to take all of the the dry trim and previous material and perform an extraction and crystallization to get the THCA from low quality biomass, and then run a few live resin runs to derive the high quality terpene fraction and combine it with the low FOS teas.
Well, and then when you're using the two as ingredients, it gives you way higher capacity to optimize your formulations. So let's say you're operating in multiple states or multiple countries even. If you want to use that exact same flavor profile in multiple different states, if you want to make a consistent product, separating the two allows you to then reconstitute them back together in an exact formulation that's every single time going to be the same.
Yeah, absolutely. It also allows you to navigate around, specific potency guidelines that the individual states have and whatnot, of the tolerances that they allow. I know a lot of people in different states have different strategies for how they dose their products based around what the regulators are expecting. And ultimately, if you know the minimum amount of HTE that's going to make a flavorful product, and then you can control the amount of THC that you're putting in, you have the full set of tools that allows you to make any product that you want.
Now, what about residual solvent in that situation? It seems like if you're keeping it in a pressure vessel, potentially, you're trying to prevent the terpenes from boiling off. Seems like there could be a risk of preventing the solid from boiling off as well.
That's a really good point, actually. Yeah, there's a few contributing factors there actually, and THCA has an enormous impact on the viscosity of the solution, and so you can much more easily remove butane. So let's say butane boils at 0 and terpenes behave like alcohols. They're boiling around 80 degrees Celsius as an example. And much easier to hold a solution at around 80 degrees Celsius and strip out the butane effectively if it's a really low viscosity. Sometimes with the thick crudes, it's still THCA, and then you're just fighting against the surface tension of viscosity of the solution, so it can't. Yeah, and then in regards to what you mentioned about the high temperature threshold with THCA, that's true as well. I think you'll have oxidation reactions where you're converting to CBN and potentially some other ones that I'm not aware of. But I think that happens at very long sustained temperatures. I know on the flip side of that, we've tried to convert THCA to CBN unsuccessfully by just using temperature.
Right, but you successfully converted into THC, no problem. And then there's another effect of oxidation that you might want to avoid. I guess they call that crystallate, or liquid diamonds is another word that they're using for that liquid, but essentially taking that isolate and then melting that down and causing the decarboxylation reaction. What do you want to look out for when you're doing that reaction?
Yeah, so the main threat there is that oxygen in the process will cause oxidation reactions that will convert some of the THCA and diminish into something undesirable and diminish your potency. And so what we suggest is that you do that decarboxylation with a nitrogen blanket over top. So typically what we'll suggest is you put it into a jacketed vessel that can be heated and pressurized, and you fill it with nitrogen and expel all of the oxygen before starting that heating reaction.
So one of the things that I've heard from people that are using this process is that they found a new use case for their white foam evaporators, because it's not really viable anymore making distillate if you can make THC isolate and then just concentrate the HTE.
I think that, yeah, wipers are currently still have a place, especially when people are running low quality biomass, which is obviously a lot cheaper to run. Your HTE is not super desirable.
Right, it's basically a throwaway.
Yeah.
It's not gonna really have the flavor profile that you're looking for. Maybe you go get that flavor profile from the live resin, and then, once you've done the isolation, you can reformulate that into a lower grade product. But while you continue with the
HTE that would come off of a lower quality biomass is perfect for a wiper. What we'll often suggest is that people decarb and devol in a reaction vessel, and then you can often get a really nice first pass from VHO crude. Especially if you're used to running ethanol crude, VHO crude is a lot nicer to run. You have a lot of starches and sugars and whatnot. A higher terpene fraction, but again, if you're devolatizing before your short bat, then it's a breeze.
It's really the residue from that high terpene fraction that is the value component.
It's any THC that is already decarbed by the time you've done your extraction. Up here in Canada, for instance, people will have had biomass for sitting in storage for a year, right? You'll have some have had some conversion, and it doesn't really make a nice, high terpene extract. And it forms a brown goop of sorts, but it has high THC, and so it's good to send it to the wiper.
And we can recover the vast majority of the value from a low quality biomass, first crystallizing it, and then recovering remaining THC from the terp sauce. And the rest of the terp sauce is basically just, throw away.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's a couple ways that you can run the THCa crystallization in the reactor. One of them being dropping the temperature to lower the solubility. The other one adding propane. Two different tools in the tool belt, both useful. Can you kind of give us an explanation of how each of them are useful and what are the different use cases?
The way that I think of it is the propane is a tool to help progress your crystallization that otherwise wouldn't. So if we have a pretty high quality crude and there's high THCa and it's going to be an easy crystallization, we'll often just use butane. We'll redissolve everything in butane and we'll cool it down and it'll crash out, and we could do that wash. When things start to get a little bit challenging to crystallize is when we start adding propane.
And it's challenging to crystallize when it's coming from low quality biomass. Things are suboptimal basically.
Yeah, exactly. And so we use the fact that THCa is less soluble in propane than it is in butane to our advantage. And what we do is we keep enough butane in there to keep everything dissolved, and we inject propane to drop the temperature very quickly, which helps with the crystallization because it'll supersaturate the solution. But also that propane, as it's injected, will decrease how much THCa the solution can hold onto, and it'll often precipitate crystallization. The thing you have to watch out for, and why we don't rely on propane too heavily, is that it seems as if THCa crystals will form smaller when propane is injected because they crystallize so quickly. And so we're balancing it out. We're often adding propane sparingly to try and get that crystallization to happen, but not so much that you have a fine silty crystal.
So it's just another tool in the tool belt that you have available so that you have the flexibility to work with any types of biomass, or if you get thrown a curveball, then you've got extra tools that you can pull out in case of emergency, essentially.
That's exactly it. Yeah. So, we'll often be doing the whole reaction in 70-30 because that's what we're extracting with, but
that's the path of least resistance. So
but then if we're having trouble, if there's, fats and waxes present or low THCa, we'll start adding propane in and we can normally get the crystallization that way.
You're saying low THCa, meaning like the crude has maybe, other compounds in there that are undesirable, or even THC, high THC content.
Yeah, we see it a lot with old biomass. We see it a lot with biomass that has CBD in it, other compounds like you said.
Okay.
Or biomass that was extracted warm too. That's something that we're pursuing more and more, is trying to run warmer extractions. And in all of those cases, propane helps you get that crush.
So running warmer extractions just because it's a little bit more inexpensive to do it that way.
Yeah, so a lot of processors' bottleneck is their cooling capacity and the size of their chillers, and so it's important to us to be able to run as warm of an extraction, because you're no longer faced with that bottleneck when you're recondensing your solvent and chilling your solvent down, but also because you actually have to use less solvent the warmer you go. You can absorb more you can absorb more cannabinoids per liter of solvent, kilogram of solvent that you're using. The warmer that solvent is.
And I guess it also depends on what type of biomass you're running, right? Like maybe if you're running, really, really high quality, if it's live resin, fresh rosin biomass, you're still going to want to go cold.
Yeah.
But having that flexibility is just also another tool in the tool belt, being able to go a little bit warmer if you're running some, less desirable product.
Yeah. I really see a delineation in the industry where, when you're running live resin products, you're trying to maintain what the biomass, the properties that the biomass had when the grower chopped it down. And so you're keeping things cold and you're trying to preserve. On the other side of things, when you have 2-year-old biomass that is pennies per gram, you're doing an industrial process to try and extract an ingredient from that. And in that case, it's all about efficiency and lowering your cost of production. And that's where we're talking about trying to do warmer extractions, removing the fats and waxes in post-processing, and then using propane to do our crystallization, all to minimize the cost of your inputs.
Very awesome. So being able to do all of those different processes across the spectrum gives you the flexibility to take biomass from all sorts of different potential sources.
Yeah, exactly. And to what we were talking about earlier, it's very valuable to be able to run low quality biomass to build up your THCa, and then immediately switch your equipment over to running colder. And I run some live resin runs to increase the value of your end product by extracting.
And then formulate that THCa with the live resin sauce, and you got a beautiful live resin product, even though maybe not all of the ingredients came from, high value extractions.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah. Let's talk post crystallization. Let's say you're doing it in a reactor vessel, or even like a column, 6 by 36 inch column, and you're using only temperature, dropping the temperature. You mentioned if you drop the temperature too quickly, you might run into some like silty isolate where the particle sizes are really small. Tell us a little bit about your experience with filtering that fine particle THC isolate.
Yeah, something we encounter a lot is that people will mention, well, I crystallize really easily. I crystallize in jars or buckets or however they're doing it. And I think that's kind of a miscommunication that is good to clear up, is that crystallization is really easy. It's really easy to get stuff to crystallize, especially if you're starting with high quality crude. If the challenges normally come about when you're trying to clean those crystals and, perform filtration steps and then wash them, especially, as your crude quality diminishes. So, we have clients before they get a crystallizer or, using the equipment, they'll try and use a material column to crystallize. This is really common.
Just your normal biomass column.
Yeah.
And then just putting the crude after the extraction, taking that crude, pushing it back into the column, and then dropping that temperature up, because they can control the temperature of the column already with their chiller.
Yeah, you can already cool your columns down, and so it's a natural place to perform the crystallization. And we've done it in that way too. The challenge with it really is you lack the control of how those crystals are going to form and what you do with it once they have formed. So if you can imagine you filled this column that only has a cooling capacity, you can't heat it up. You fill it up with crude and then you perform a crystallization. Well, oftentimes the crystals will form and they'll bridge and they'll form kind of an impenetrable mass at the bottom of the column.
Right. You don't have control over the concentration once you put it back into that. Once you put it from your collection vessel back into the column, the concentration that entered the column that's your final concentration.
You can't make any adjustments. So if you decide you want to remove a little bit more solvent to increase your concentration, for example, you're stuck. You have to drain now a cold viscous solution with a filter at the bottom of it. And so often people are taking off their columns and dumping it out, and it gets a little bit janky.
Messy.
Yeah, messy. It's not that the crystallizers is the only thing that can crystallize. Really what the focus is to have a wide array of tools that you can use to adjust your process as you're looking in the sight glass and deciding you need to be able to change things.
And also based on the quality of that crude that's in the process, having a variety of different options as far as how to process that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so another thing on the concentration is that if you're too dilute, often you won't get all of your THCa out, or you'll leave a lot behind. So, people will be concerned that they don't want to send too viscous of a solution into a column because it's difficult to get through a 3/8 or a 1/2 inch line.
Right. We've had clients have troubles actually even pushing that solution back half a column.
Often the viscosity that you want to crystallize that is too thick to be able to reliably move it through, especially if you have a pressure differential and you're going to be losing some of your solvent as you enter into that concoction. You're dealing with clogs in the line. You're dealing with clogs in the line. And so they'll transfer it a little bit more dilute. But that has a different effect where you're actually going to not crash all the THCa. You're going to leave a lot behind.
So that way you do your washout, then you've got THC in both you've got, maybe you have THC powder or isolate in one of the columns, but your HDE is still full of THCa.
Yeah. You just don't have control over the way that those crystals form and ensuring that you can get all of the THCa out.
Right. And so the way that they form is a function of the concentration level of THC in the solution, as well as like the speed at which the temperature drops in that reaction vessel, right?
Yeah, an example, and maybe we'll be able to show a screen capture here or something like that, but essentially what will happen if you're very dilute is you'll start to form diamonds on the side, in the sense that you'll form a thin film of THCa around the outside of your column, but the inside is still a THCa-rich solution.
Why is that?
That's because there's really two types of crystallization. There's crystals that form because you've supersaturated the solution and they're falling out of solution immediately as a kind of a flash crystallization, a cascading effect. And that's what we're going after, is you want all of this THCa to become precipitating at once, right? The other form of crystallization, which is actually what you're doing when you're growing diamonds, is you have these seeds or these nucleation points, right? You're building crystals off of those sites.
That's a lattice. I've heard people use that term, right?
Yeah, a lattice, and it's a much more selective process. You end up with a higher purity crystal, but it takes way too much time, whereas way longer. Right. And so what we found is best is to actually do rapid, fast crystallizations to increase your purity quickly over multiple successive crystallizations, as opposed to waiting for a longer crystallization.
Okay, so you're saying crystallization one, recrystallization, and then finishing the process after that.
Yeah, exactly. But to bring it back to the equipment that you're using, you need to be able to see in what's going on. You need to be able to heat and cool in the same vessel, and you need to be able to really have control of all your parameters so that you can ensure that you're repeatedly doing that fast crystallization.
And it seems like the filtration process could be challenging, especially with larger batches over, say, maybe 3 to 5 kilos. If all you've got is one filter disc, what kind of problems do you run into there?
Yeah, so filter clogs are one of the most challenging because you've got, a really high value product suspended above a small filter. And so really we've got two mechanisms that we use for filtration. The first strategy that we use is we'll try and control the particle size of the crystal. So we'll try and form a large crystal, and we can see when you say large crystal, 100 microns. That's okay. So really, yeah. So
a large, not necessarily large, but granular, let's say.
Yeah, really what we're trying to form is the consistency of the slushy. So the analogy that we always use is when you're finished a slushy and you pull the last slurp and you drain all the color of the slushy. That's what we're trying to do.
The HTE is the color.
The HTE is the color, and the slushy is the VA or Sude, yeah, as the isolate. And that doesn't work if you have a slush, right? It doesn't work if you have really, really fine granules of ice, because they'll be slicked up the straw. You actually want those individual particles to be large enough that the HTE can drain out and leave that isolate behind. And so typically we're talking about, 100 micron is the ideal crystal size. And the way that we're controlling that is with our process parameters.
It sounds like that's kind of the reason why you want to have a clear line of sight to what's going on in your process as well, right?
Yeah, and that's why we made our crystallizer short and fat, essentially, so you can minimize how the thickness, and you can really see everything that's going on, and the flocculations and stuff that are telling you these visual cues that your crystal size is going to form appropriately.
Okay.
So back to filtration. There's two main ways. For really large batches, what we'll do, and with higher quality Crudes from the Easy, we'll form these large crystal sizes and we'll gently let it settle, and then we'll pull the HT through the bed. But often with stuff that's challenging, you're going to be stuck, adding propane or essentially performing various crystallization steps that mean that you're going to form a siltier THCa isolate. That's a really common struggle. And so we also have, before you go on, what's the problem with the silty THCa? The silty THCa is more prone to clogging. It's harder to pull the liquid through it. What'll end up happening is you'll form these channels as you're pulling the washing solvent through the isolate, and you'll leave behind these pockets of HTE.
Well, how if you're only going through a 6-inch filter disc?
Yeah, it'll clog immediately.
I mean, I know a lot of our clients are using CRC medias, and when you go fine on a CRC media, we're mostly kind of solved this problem now with the granulated medias, but it's the same effect, right? Like where you've got maybe some fine powder, and then just all of a sudden the rate that you're moving through that 6-inch disc is like, glacial.
Yeah, very, very slow. And the other challenge with it is that, with CRC media, you're not redissolving things as it sits there.
Right.
And also fine particles will redissolve them. So you really don't want to have a significant dwell time there when you're performing that wash. Could get that.
Oh, I see. So if you're filtering as taking a long time to filter, during that process, you're actually redissolving the THC isolate.
You're losing yield.
Yeah. And so that redissolved isolate ends up in the HTE fraction, and really you want it to be held back in the crystal fraction.
Yeah, and that's another thing too with temperature control, is you need to ensure that your filters are kept cold too, because that will also help that along and prevent that undesirable dissolving. So that's why we make sure that we have our jackets cover our filters, essentially.
Of course.
The other challenge with the silt is that, so you'll often, in order to get it through a silty material, you'll increase the pressure. And typically people use that with the nitrogen, or they'll add propane to the end space, and both of those will actually warm it up and cause turbulence and dissolve it as well. So really you want to avoid pressure during filtration.
Really? Oh, that seems counterintuitive.
Yeah, well, you just want to, I guess I would rephrase it. I would say that you want to remove the necessity for having a lot of pressure involved in the process. You want it to be a very clean, easy filtration.
Right. It just flows on its own.
Yeah. So to move to the second way that we'll do filtration. So if we have a really silty mixture and it's challenging to do the slush detect, so to speak, what we'll do is we'll use a really large surface area candle filter that's entirely cooled. And then what we're doing there is we're sending all of the silt deliberately onto the surface of a large filter and then washing it that way.
So one of the practices that we're helping a lot of our clients with right now is taking the ingredients-based approach, where you're separating out, if you're crystallizing THCa, you're ending up with a THC isolate as well as a high terpene extract, and then you're able to, just focus on using those two as ingredients. What are some of the advantages that our viewers may not have thought of that goes along with that?
Yeah, there's three main advantages that we often talk about with ingredient-based, manufacturing and formulations. One of the advantages, most significant advantage, is being able to have just-in-time manufacturing, right? So you've got your HCE, your THCa, and your THC on a shelf, and you can decide based on what your sales demands are, what products you want to make. And so
instead of having the extractor maybe have to decide it when they're sourcing the biomass, when they're doing the extraction, and when they're doing their pour off, they're not involved in that decision.
Yeah, and that can be very challenging, right? And you have to have a very talented extractor who can say, you're saying, oh, we want to have stable shatter, or we want to have diamonds and sauce, or whether it's BR, or the caviar out of the same thing, and then they're getting into this, whipping techniques and these pour-offs and these very specific things, while also trying to manage the logistics of keeping an extraction process running as fast as possible.
So part of that is sourcing the biomass too, right? You got to align your biomass sourcing with the product production, the specific product production that you're aiming to produce.
Yeah, and so you have all of these, dependencies within your extraction process that any one of them can throw off your end goal, which is to produce diamonds and sauce. And so, we speak to a more efficient process being extracted all the same, extract cold enough that you're not going to pull too many fats and waxes and produce a crude, and then crystallize that crude into base ingredients. And then you can pick and choose what ingredients you want to combine and how to make these different product formulations.
And those formulations can be a lot more consistent as well, because once you split those two compounds, you can recombine them in exact formulas.
Yeah, and being able to be very specific with your formulations has an enormous impact. You can use less of certain ingredients if they're valuable, and you can use them more sparingly. For instance, HTE can be stretched really far across lots. You can take THCa from lower quality biomass and use it in a higher quality terpene fraction. You can do all sorts of things, and you just have the full degree of control.